All right, all right. I think I have enough Wi-Fi juice. Okay, I'm back. I had to remix that because my Wi-Fi acts out. As I was saying, I deleted and we're starting over. May was Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I wanted to make this lecture. For whatever reason, I didn't do it. And I decided to just, this is going to be very brief. It's a hot-ass day. It's a Saturday. Why the fuck are you making this video? But I felt like some of the posts I made over the past few weeks, it kind of lends itself to just a very, very, very brief Asian American history mini lecture. Especially yesterday, I posted a screenshot of this lady going off on Twitter about, you know, everything that's going on at the border, and she was basically saying, like, don't target Latinos, go after the Asians, which is a whole other topic, a whole other level of ignorance we don't really have to get into right now. But I feel like there's a lot of little known or lesser known things about how Asian American and Asian communities operate that affect not only how like white supremacy treats non-white people in the United States, but also how Asian communities tend to be viewed, because there are a lot of misunderstandings. Some are the making of, you know, the people themselves. Some are just general, you know, like lesser known things. So there was a couple things I just wanted to cover very quickly. I'm not an expert. I'm speaking as someone who is Asian American. I'm speaking as someone that minored in Asian American studies, so it doesn't mean I'm like the most all-knowing person there ever was, but I definitely feel like we can use Facebook as a little platform for, if you're friends with me, you're not a racist, awful person, but if you had some like misunderstanding or you wanted to share information with other people, I just wanted to make a brief video that we could kind of talk about that. So a couple things that I wanted to speak about is number one, I've known from experience, as well as I think a lot of people don't know this, so a lot of times I think that the Asian American community is kind of stereotyped for not being socially active or really necessarily being involved with like activist culture anywhere in the United States. And I think that a lot of people don't know, particularly if you are like first generation, depending on how your family came to the United States, if you came here through a lot of trauma, like through war and through poverty, and there was a lot of negative things going on that brought you here, social services and being able to use your rights to speak out as seen as like utter socialism and is seen as very dangerous. And so I remember when I was a youth leader with Californians for Justice in high school, a lot of the students who, you know, my age were high school, college students involved with this organization, and sometimes the parents of my peers who were from China, from Vietnam, Cambodia, different places in Southeast Asia, if they came here through war and were like lower income people, they felt like having their kids speak out about things like what's going on in their high schools and being very politically active, they thought this was total socialism, and they were very worried. They even thought it was communist. They were very worried about their kids being involved with an organization that was about youth empowerment, but sometimes in certain languages there are not words to like explain what this means and that it's okay and that you're being like an active citizen. And so sometimes you have parents or grandparents that are just so happy that you're like in the States and quote like a safe place. They don't necessarily want you to speak out, because no matter what state you're in the United States, I don't mean state like a place, state like meaning if you're poor, if you're working hella tough, like if there's a lot going on around you, it's considered safer than being like in a war-torn place, that's, you know, with like bombs and rapes and a lot of different things that people in our families, you know, may have seen. It's kind of like you deal with it, you rock it out. It's better than where it was. So there's definitely a fear of being socially active. So that's not to say that all Asian Americans are like this, that every place is like this, but I think there's a lack of understanding on why at times you don't see a lot of like social activity from particularly Asian immigrants like in San Jose or the greater Bay Area. There are like language difficulties, there's a lack of outreach, and sometimes organizers who might not be from our communities don't understand that legit people really think that shit is like communist, socialist. They are very worried. They are probably dealing with a lot of trauma that has not been diagnosed or dealt with. So there's like a lack of understanding it's okay, and that it's more like encouraged in a certain aspect of our culture in terms of like American culture. So I think a lot of people like they don't know that, so they don't know how to like do that outreach. So that shit like does not happen. And I think that people take it as like, oh, Asians are clannish, or like they're not trying to get involved, or like they ain't really trying to like be about it. No, it's not sometimes, but you know what I mean. But I think there's this like lack of understanding that if you came here from like World War II, or you came here during the Vietnam War, you know what I'm saying? You've seen so much trauma, people died. You don't want to like get involved like that because you've seen like what really happened in your country. So I just think there isn't that perspective, and that's why things like ethnic studies are very important to kind of like understand. Moving away from that topic, I have two other very, very brief topics I want to talk about. Keep it simple. I think there's another thing that a lot of people don't understand, and actually a little bit will come down to my hair right now, but not exactly. So there is a lot of anger, and rightfully so, about why a lot of Asian immigrants own black hair care businesses, like places where you buy hair and other products. And it's not to say there isn't racism towards black people involved, but the intent isn't racism towards black people. So this is a situation where neither group, meaning black people who feel like, why are you owning a business that sells products that cater to my community, and Asians needing to own a business. So it's a situation where neither community is right or wrong in their feelings. But what a lot of people don't understand is if you come to the United States, again, depending on what trauma or drama brought you to the United States, and you don't have a full fluency on the English language, you might not be heavily educated, or you might not have come with a lot of money to start a new life, particularly the money and the English being a big thing. You try to own a business where you know you can make money. It doesn't matter how much English that you know to start the business, and everybody in your family can work there. And that's how initially a lot of Asian immigrants got into owning things like liquor stores in lower income urban areas, particularly where a lot of black folks live. That's how a lot of them got into owning black hair shops. That's how a lot of Asians got into owning donut shops. And you might think like, well, that shit is racist. So I mean, it might turn out to be racist, but the intent was not to be racist. So it's one of those things where once one person becomes successful at it, the ethnic succession, if more people come from my country, I'm gonna teach them this is how you get on, and then everyone kind of owns this business. So it's not to say that there is no racial profiling or racial problems that come from this, but it's not the intent is what I'm asking people to understand. So you might be like, well, if I go to Oakland, how come all the black hair shops are owned by Asians? That's part of what it is, because if you go there often, the people who work there who own it don't necessarily know English. And you might think, well, you had enough money to own a business. They did, but maybe they used to have like a PhD in like philosophy and like Korea, and then they decided to come to the United States for their kids, their grandkids, for whatever purpose, and could not get a job doing that and don't know the language. That's a way that you feed your family that doesn't really require a lot of startup money or command of English. So again, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, but it's understanding the intent. So there can be racism that plays out by those misunderstandings that groups have about each other, in those cases being Asian immigrants and potentially African American communities. But I'm just asking you to understand the intent behind how certain businesses came to be, particularly in the Bay, LA. You see it a lot on the West Coast, in like lower income communities. You'll see Asian immigrants coming in and opening up, like I said, black hair shops, liquor stores, donut shops, and catering primarily to people who are also people of color, but not necessarily Asian. Like, why are you opening up a business in our community? That's why. So again, I'm not telling you to be like, give it the green light, like you think it's okay, or that you co-sign it being in your neighborhood, but potentially that's why it's in your neighborhood, because there is a lack of English, and you take all the money you got to come to the new country and you figure out how are you going to make a living, and that's kind of why some of those businesses have come to be. Now, the racial problems that play out after that is a whole other issue we can't really address in this video, but it's just understanding the intent why that's happening. So I'm not saying don't be mad about it. I'm just saying to have a little bit more compassion and understand why that potentially opened up in your neighborhood, and what function that it serves, like why it's there. In closing, because I want to keep this super brief, I'm definitely down to make other videos where we can kind of like talk about these topics, but I think in closing, I myself, if you follow my page, I'm always talking about gentrification all over the Bay Area. I'm hella pissed. I'm not for it. I'm not co-signing it. San Jose, Oakland, San Francisco, LA. I mean, it's happening everywhere. This gentrification shit is happening everywhere. But I think one of the biggest things that I'm not seeing discussed in regards to gentrification is Asian immigration. And I don't mean on some anti-Asian stuff. So just get it right, because I think that if it's not done well, it's going to turn very anti-Asian very quick. Like earlier today, I posted the photo of Vincent Chin, and there was an issue with capitalism that happened, but these white men that lost their jobs in the auto industry in Detroit, they're not mad at capitalism. They decided to get mad at Japanese people, and they happen to think that Vincent Chin was Japanese, beat his ass till he died, hate crime status, so they got mad at the wrong thing. Don't be mad at the people, be mad at the capitalism. But I think when we're looking at gentrification, a lot of what's happening with high tech is that we're bringing in people from India and China because they have more math and science skills, as well as the fact, even though they have more money than maybe you or I, they're also getting played because they're being paid less than American people with the education. But they're bringing people on visas. They're going to work them to death for 2-3 years. You know what I'm saying? Their little visa going to expire. They're going to send them back to their country, done and done, until that industry kind of like doesn't matter anymore. When we're talking about gentrification, we're seeing a lot of people move into our communities. I mean, in terms of people moving into, say, Oakland from other cities and states, we're seeing a lot of white folks moving in, right? That's kind of what's happening. But at least in the South Bay, where tech is the bigger industry, what are we seeing? There's always been a lot of Asian communities in the South Bay, at least in the past like 30 or so years. But what we're seeing right now, Cupertino, San Jose, Santa Clara, Milpitas, we're seeing an even larger influx of immigration from Asia, and a lot of that is for high tech. If it's not to work in high tech right now, we're seeing, Asian parents wanting to come have kids here or bringing young children here, thinking that there's going to be all this opportunity in the tech industry to make money. And when we're having conversations about gentrification, we're not really talking, we're talking very much about white and black and sometimes Latino, but we're never really talking about Asians and Asian Americans. And it's a deep issue and it's multifaceted because, people like myself that are third generation, my family been here forever, ever. And you're talking about people that are coming in right now, many of whom are brought for tech. So a lot of displacement that is happening right now, at least I could say in the South Bay, is we're seeing an influx of Asian immigration and businesses that accommodate the needs of those folks, whether it's restaurants or grocery stores or entertainment that kind of meets the needs of people who are coming. It's gentrification that is problematic, but it's not necessarily racist, if that makes sense. It's like there is racism that is attached to that, but again, the intent is not to be racist. So we have to look more at the issues of capitalism and the way that a lot of Asian communities, particularly Asian immigrants from India and China, are kind of like getting played because they might be coming in with hella more money than you and I have, and they're making potentially more money than you or I have, but for what they're doing and what the companies can pay, they're being brought over because they have math and science skills that you and I don't have, but could be paid less than if they sent you or me to school to go get those skills. So again, we have to be kind of very aware of the capitalism that's being involved in the ways that Asian Americans and Asian immigrants are kind of being scapegoated in this by either being completely ignored or when we are brought up is being kind of seen like, oh, look how good they're doing and they have money. So it's just to be very aware of what's happening. And I hope that we can have more conversations about gentrification that feature Asian immigrant stories, experiences, and more understanding and more Asian American narratives of people like myself, people like my family that have been here for generations, because for whatever reason, that's not included. And I think that possibly part of why that's not included is because when we include that story, we really have to look at tech and capitalism that kind of makes this whole valley go round, right? And we don't want to do that because, we could just be mad at the Asian immigrants that seem to have money, right? But that's the easy way out because that's not the real story. But if we really look at like how the tech companies are operating, I'm saying that's the bigger issue that we're not talking about. In closing, to kind of tie into that whole thing about how we're not looking at the capitalism with tech companies, if you are aware of what the model minority myth is, if you're not, I'm going to keep it very brief. It's related to all these topics that I previously discussed, and when I finished the live, if you're late to the story, you're free to watch it from the beginning. So if you don't know what model minority means, it's basically a stereotype that seems good, that is often used to kind of lift up Asian American communities at the disadvantage of Latino and African American communities, or used as a way to kind of paint Asian pain, suffering, trauma, needs quite invisible. And the history of this stereotype is that in the 1960s, Time magazine wrote an article specifically about the Japanese American community. And understand, context this is very contextual. This is in kind of the height of the civil rights movement when we see African American communities fighting for civil rights. Stop lynching us. We want to sit at the front of the bus. We don't want you sticking dogs on us. We don't want police bombing our houses. We're not going to put up with this anymore. And you've seen white allies joining them to not only change communities on a small level, but change the actual federal government laws to, abide by these things. And so, a lot of privileged white folks, they didn't want this. They don't want black folks to have equal rights. So Time magazine decided to write an article about the model minority being Japanese Americans, who by this at time, there was more immigration coming in, and a lot of communities had been here for several generations. And despite being interned in World War II, a lot of those communities began to flourish educationally and economically good for them. And so the article was kind of talking about like, well, if Japanese Americans can be interned and be jailed and be beaten and be separated, abused, have all their, income and everything taken from them, and they're doing hella good now, hey, you black people that are complaining, why can't you do better? So the article wasn't necessarily to celebrate Japanese American communities. It was using Japanese American success at the expense of African Americans who are fighting for civil rights. And so after this, another similar article was written about Chinese Americans, and so later it got applied to all Asians, despite the fact that after the Vietnam War, a lot of Southeast Asian refugees are coming in very poor, dealing with things like rape, trauma, abuse, and their journey to the United States. So it was something that was used to make Asians seem just like so super like insanely smart and better than like every other group, and the ability to like, that American myth, lift yourself up by like your bootstraps, that's that whole thing. And so because of that, you have a lot of other people of color, particularly Latinos and African American groups, that felt a little suspicious of Asians because of these myths that were kind of applied and misused. And then you also have some Asians that have their own internal racism against Latinos and blacks, thinking like, oh, we're better than y'all because we're doing well and you're not. So it's a very problematic myth that tends to be used often. And that myth is bad because it creates internal strife between groups of color. It's also bad because if people think Asians are so, perfect, it tends to be one of the reasons why Asian and Asian Americans don't get a lot of social services. Not only do we deal with the cultural pressures of not saying things when we need help, but also a societal view that we don't need things. And so that myth kind of lends itself to what I was talking about in the beginning of this video, gentrification, and why sometimes you see Asian immigrant business open up in your neighborhood and how you don't have to agree with it, but there's the intent of why the people have opened this up in your neighborhood. So this is just a very mini lecture. Like I said, I'm not the master of anything. I'm speaking as an Asian American. I've been very involved in the community since forever. I minored in Asian American studies, and with that little screenshot I posted the other day of that lady freaking out on Twitter about how Asians are the problem right now, and a few weeks ago when with people running for mayor in San Francisco, there was Miss Kim, the Korean American candidate running for mayor, and she went to go give like a speech in the Fillmore neighborhood, which is in with a lot of gentrification, and there was a predominantly African American crowd that was not about her life. I understand, I respect the gentrification. However, the issue came up where instead of just not agreeing with her speech, someone called her a skinny rice-eating motherfucker, and it became very anti-Asian very quick. And that's kind of what I wanted to make this video, is that when we talk about Asian American history and experience, it's not simply an Asian issue, a white versus black issue. Is very like nuanced. So it doesn't, in certain situations, especially the one with, Miss Kim, it was like no one was really right or wrong. I understand why that gentleman was mad. What he said was wrong, but I get why he said it. But I also understand why, Miss Kim is coming in as a politician and trying to like improve the community. So it's having these very like nuanced conversations, and in certain situations, we're not right or wrong. It's just understanding the intent. So if you choose to watch the video from the beginning, I appreciate it. You don't have to agree with anything that I'm saying, but it's just to break down that there are kind of like things that aren't known about our communities. So for people outside of our, racial and ethnic communities, not understanding why we or our families do what we do, why our communities function how they function, that in certain situations things aren't right or wrong, but understanding the intent to why they happen could really help you understand a lot more about not necessarily the Asian American experience, but just why things kind of turn out how they do. And you don't have to like it, but you can have that empathy and that compassion to why things are kind of going how they're going. So as angry as that screenshot I put up made me of that lady freaking out about Asians, it's mostly sad to me and embarrassing for her that for whatever reason there is a lack of understanding about how a lot of I wouldn't say our culture, because she wasn't even talking about culture. It's not so much about how our culture functions, about how different things function and how we have came to the United States and kind of built our lives here, and how that kind of plays out. So I can understand in a way her ignorance. I get her I understand her misinformation, you know what I'm saying? I kind of get where that comes from, and it's like, how do we kind of address that so that we can all do better? Because it's like, I'm upset with her, but at the same time I understand that there is not where is she supposed to learn? You know what I'm saying? Where can she kind of like learn that from? So I hope that if you learn anything from this, it maybe if you hear someone saying the type of ignorant things that you saw that on that screenshot of what that lady was posting, that maybe it could be like, hey, you know, I was really researching or kind of trying to understand more about this experience, and maybe you share some of that information. So we can't change everyone overnight, but we kind of have to have the difficult conversations to kind of get people on the same page. And they don't have to agree, but at least they can have that level of understanding. So it's a hot Saturday. I don't know that people want to see a lecture about Asian American history, but with all the things I'm seeing in the media right now, and I didn't get an opportunity to make this during Asian American History Month, I just thought it was important to do a little brief lecture and just share some things and some trains of thought that might help y'all as we see a lot of kind of sad things unfolding all over the media, all over social media, and just hearing people spew ignorance all the time. I hope that is something that adds some positivity to the conversation. I love y'all. Thank you for watching, and I'll see y'all soon.